All right, everybody, good late morning. Welcome back. We've got more draft prospect stuff to take a look at today. Now we're going to take a look at the defense. And I think it's become pretty clear the defense is stronger than the offense this year. I still don't necessarily think that it's stellar on that side of the ball. I feel like it's pretty strong at edge. I really like this edge crop. Safety's good. Cornerback is good, but cornerback's kind of good every year. I don't know if this one is radically better than a typical year in terms of top corner prospects. Defensive line is kind of more in the middle, and linebacker's really weak. So even that, I think if you mash it all together, what I'm trying to say is that 2025 NFL draft class, a little bit weak, a little bit on the weaker side. And it's just not a class that I feel like there's going to be as much value in as there typically is. Like, I don't think any quarterback, just as an example, I don't think any of the quarterbacks in this draft class would go above, I'd say, the top four quarterbacks from last year. And then there's just a big trickle down from that, right? Like, you've also got an issue where I feel like the talent level of even the top tackles is below the typical top tackle level of talent. We don't have a Bosa or Chase Young level edge rusher prospect in this class. We we might have like a Devin Witherspoon, Christian Gonzalez level cornerback prospect. I will acknowledge that, but it's just this is the side of the ball you want to be on, but it's still not great. Nose tackle. I'm happy to report there were a few nose tackles that stood out for me this week. The top two guys are pretty much always going to be here because they're really good and they're more than just nose tackles, but I still like to talk about them. Kenneth Grant of Michigan, 2 tackles, 1 for loss, recovered a fumble, 4 QB pressures. Michigan allowed only 17 points and 163 rushing yards, which doesn't sound great, but it was only 3.9 yards a carry, not the worst at all. 71.6. Deontay Walker of Kentucky had another good game as near as I could tell. Now, it is worth noting that Walker usually plays over B gap. He's not an A gap player most of the time, but he's often in the A gap. I'd say probably a third of his snaps are probably in A gap. So when we're evaluating him, we have to know that he's much more than just a nose tackle, but it is something he can do sometimes. 4 tackles, 1 for loss, which was a sack, 2 QB pressures. Kentucky allowed 24 points. They did get run all over, which you don't really like when you're talking about the nose tackle. 328 rushing yards, 7 yards a carry, but I do get the sense that he played well, and I don't think the bad run defense is necessarily something I would put on his head. And then you've got Dante Corleone, who is probably the most pure nose tackle in this draft. He spends basically all his time in A-gap for the Bearcats. 1 tackle, which that usually that would be kind of like some kind of a punchline, but I do actually want to single out Corleone as playing well this week, even though he only had the 1 tackle and no other numbers of any significance, because the opponent only ran for 123 rushing yards, 3.1 yards per carry, and you can see PFF reflect this. Like, when you're a player like Corleone and you're always in A gap, the run defense is going to kind of go with you. You're going to be the starting point of the run defense, one way or the other. It's a little different for a guy like Walker because he's still spending about 2/3 of his snaps in B gap, not really at the very center of the defense in the same way. But a guy like Corleone, it feels like the run defense really starts with him, and you can see that that was reflected well in the overall team numbers, even if they didn't come up in his individual ones. Edge rushers this week, it was pretty good. I liked a lot of what I saw. JT at OSU, he makes the list again. 5 tackles, 2 for loss, a sack, 2 QB pressures. OSU allowed 17 points, 152 passing yards, which is actually really good. 4.6 yards per pass, 66.9 PFF. Good game for JT. Nick Scourton of the Aggies, welcome back. I've talked about him before. He's probably going to be a first-round pick in this draft. 4 tackles, 1.5 for loss, had half a sack, but he had 7 pressures. This should not be 7 sacks. That would have been really cool, but 7 pressures, 23 points allowed by A&M, 405 passing yards, so they did get passed on a lot. But when you only allow 23 points, that means you were probably doing a lot of plays or making a lot of plays that forced your opponent into big negative plays that killed drives. So I wouldn't trip on that nearly as much. 72.6 PFF. Princely Umanmian of Ole Miss, talked about this guy a lot this year. He had another nice game. 3 tackles, including 2 sacks. 7 pressures, so he's living in the backfield for the Ole Miss. 14 points allowed by Ole Miss. 182 passing yards against Oklahoma. Not even 6 yards per pass. 62.6. I think they dinged him for some missed tackles, but overall, good game by Princely. Moving on, Ashton Gilote. We've talked about him a little bit, the Louisville guy. He had a great game for the Cardinal. 9 tackles, 2.5 for loss, and that had nothing to do with like sacks. He didn't have any sacks in this game. He had 7 pressures. So he didn't get a sack, but he resided in the backfield for basically that whole game. Louisville did allow 27 points, but 164 yards. Not even 6 yards per pass, 76.4. So really good game. And final guy, I think he's new, Braden Swinson of the Tigers, LSU. 7 tackles for him, 2 for loss, including a sack, 6 pressures. Now LSU did allow 38 points, but A&M only had 134 passing yards. So they didn't get beat because of the pass. They got beat because Nussmeier threw 3 interceptions more than anything. 70.1 PFF grade. So grinding along here. This is a nice, deep, fun edge crop. I think there's going to be a lot to talk about in that group. Whether or not the Seahawks are in need of one, I think we're still going to have the conversation because I like these guys. Linebacker. A little better than usual this week, I guess. I was able to dig up 5 guys. One of them is arguably not deserving of being there, but we'll talk about that in a second. Let's start with some guys who did deserve to be there. Francisco Mauigoa. Been a while since I've talked about him, but I have discussed him as one of my favorite sleepers before for the Hurricanes. 7 tackles, half a tackle for loss, 3 pressures, allowed 31 receiving yards on 4 targets, so a little less than 8 yards per target. Not the best, but nothing that's breaking your team. Miami allowed 133 rushing yards. Not great efficiency, but not something that took over the game either. 14 points allowed by the Hurricanes. Remember, they're playing that awful FSU offense, of course. 73.5 PFF, good game by him. Jihad Campbell of the Crimson Tide, another good game for him. Alabama pitched a shutout, so their defense is going to get some credit for that. Campbell, 8 tackles, 1 for loss, a sack, 1 QB pressure, which was, of course, the sack. 5 receiving yards allowed, which was 2.5 yards per target. And Bama's defense was pretty shut down. There was a little bit of success running the ball, but not enough. 167 yards, 4.3 yards per, and a 67.7 PFF grade. So he's good too. Stutzman had an interesting game here. I did put him here because at a certain point the standard just gets low enough, but it was a very weird game for Stutzman. 9 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss. So he did his job there. He had 4 QB pressures, which is really good. Making a lot of plays in or around the quarterback. But he got destroyed in coverage, and that's why his PFF grade was so low. He got targeted 4 times and gave up 4 catches for 62 yards. That's 15.5 yards per target. That is kind of breaking your defense. So even though Oklahoma stopped the run really well, not even 70 yards against, 2.2 yards per, PFF grade is barely above sea level. So 26 points allowed is not great, but it is pretty respectable. There's a lot of stuff to like here from Stutzman, but he got lit up in coverage and it hurt him. Jay Higgins is next, the Iowa guy. I'm a fan of his, really liking what I'm seeing there. 8 tackles and a pick, 10 return yards on the pick. 2 pressures on the quarterback in this game, so he did a little bit of everything. 28 receiving yards allowed on 2 targets. Not great, but not a big sample size either. And Iowa allows all of 14 points and 43 rushing yards. 71.6 for Higgins. Really good player, playing a good game. Finally, we got Landon Barton here, and I struggled with whether or not I wanted to include him here for the Utah Utes. This is Cody Barton's younger brother, by the way. But Barton had 12 tackles, including 1 for loss, a pressure, and the Utah team only allowed 17 points. but Barton was dinged for like 4 missed tackles, I think, in this game, and Utah got run all over, 230 yards. They got run on pretty badly. I wasn't sure if I considered that to be a good enough game or not, but I decided to throw him here. PFF kind of reflects the fact that he had such a mixed game, 59.9. But read into it as you will. Okay. Final set here, defensive backs. This week it's just going to be safeties. Wasn't impressed with the safety play this week either overall. I could only find 4 guys. A lot of guys were off. A lot of guys just didn't really do much of anything that I thought deserved being called out. So I got Jalen Reed, the Penn State guy, and he's kind of a guy who's filling in for the injured guys because they've got a Winston over there who hasn't played in over a month. They've got, I think they've got that other edge rusher, Danny Sutton. I'm not sure if he's playing very much right now. So Jalen Reed's one of the guys who's trying to step up to help account for the fact that they're missing some guys right now. Had a great game for the Nittany Lions this week. 5 tackles, half a tackle for loss. Had a pick that he took back, 19 yards for a touchdown. Did allow 29 receiving yards when targeted on 3 targets. Not great, but not defense breaking either. Penn State allowed 17 points, but only 150 passing yards. Not even 5, barely over 4.5 yards per pass. 64.2 PFF grade. Seems a little bit stingy given he had a pick 6, but I know that they gave him some crap for some missed tackles. Malachi Moore of Alabama was another guy who stepped up for a very, very impressive defensive effort by the Crimson Tide. I know it's against, I can't remember exactly which team it was, but it's weaker competition. But Malachi Moore did legitimately have one of his best games of the year so far. 4 tackles and a pick that he took back 31 yards, a pass deflection, a pass breakup beyond the pick. And he didn't allow anything through the air, 0 receiving yards allowed on 2 targets, 0 points allowed by Bama, only 3 yards per pass, 72 passing yards total by the opponent, 77.6. So he continues to be one of the better, more interesting safeties in this class, even if he's not the best. New name here. Nice to have a new name. Hunter Wohler of Wisconsin, the Badgers. Played a nice little game, and he's starting to creep up draft boards a little bit. For Wisconsin, had 11 tackles and a pressure. 33 receiving yards allowed on 3 targets, so that's 11 yards per target, but small sample size. Wisconsin allowed 28 points, 246 passing yards, which was just under 8 yards a pass. 69.4. Pretty good, right? Pretty good, worth noting, and worth taking into consideration going forward. And then we got one more guy at the end here, Billy Bauman Jr. Again, it was pulling teeth for me to get to 5. As you can see, I didn't pull it off. So it just was one of those sleepy weeks for cornerbacks, or safeties, I think. But Billy Bauman, 7 tackles, including half a tackle for loss. Allowed 32 receiving yards on 4 targets, which is, not great, but not terrible. 26 points allowed by OU, 311 passing yards, 10.4. So even that, you're not excited about that. 64.3 PFF grade. And yeah, that's really all I could do this week. It was a little bit weak at safety, I think, this week. And this segment struggles when any position comes up a little bit empty, I think. But we do the best that we can, and I will be seeing you guys later. More videos coming. Go Hawks. And yeah, that's how I see it shaping up on the defensive side of the draft.